The South African Independent Power Producers Association has raised concern about the impact of rule changes. IEPs or IPPs must now meet a list of requirements before they can connect to the electricity grid, and the cost associated with those requirements, we're told, could become a deterrent. For more on this, let's speak to the chairperson of the SA Association of Independent Power Producers, Brian Day. Brian, a very good evening to you. Grateful for your time. So, the issue of cost has been widely spoken about, but there are other issues which you have raised. Put those in context for those of us not too familiar with how this would actually work.
Thanks very much for having me, and greetings to all your viewers. Yes, Eskom's got a really tough challenge at the moment to allocate the small amount of grid capacity that is available, and their challenge is to try and make sure that any allocation of that capacity that they do make gets used very quickly. And that's because of the situation in terms of the generation requirements in the country and load shedding, etc. What's happened, though, is it seems that they've gone too far in terms of requiring onerous extent of progress on the development of projects, which means then that the developers or the IPPs will have to have done extensive work before they can get to the point where they apply for grid connection. And that's where the problem comes in. And it must be remembered that Eskom themselves are a licensee under NERSA. So they have to work within the obligations of non-discriminatory access. And that is obviously a constraint. We believe that the rules should go through the Grid Code Advisory Committee and then on to NERSA for full public participation and then a decision by the NERSA board. So we do not believe that it is a decision that Eskom can make on their own, even on an interim basis.
And these include environmental and water usage rights, a signed power purchase agreement, as well as a year's data on available sun or 2 years on available wind. Why is that something that would be cumbersome for the majority of people in this space? Is that not data that you would have at hand anyway?
Those are all processes that will be happening. But the point is that project development is the art of parallel processes. To put the budget quote process right at the end and expect all the other work to have been done beforehand, that's where the problem comes in. And you're quite correct in some of the ones that you've noted. On the power purchase agreement, it's not a full-form power purchase agreement, but it is the heads of terms, assigned heads of terms. So that specifically requires both the developer IPP and the off-taker, the big corporate mining company, etc., to have gone through their full governance process to be able to sign such a document. So we will be suggesting that the old way, which was some sort of preferred bidder or letter of intent, would be sufficient. On the water use license, that is not even a requirement under the renewables program. The requirement there is a legal opinion saying that it is likely that you will receive a water use license. And similarly with other aspects. On the resource assessment, it is no longer a necessity under REAP or generally to have site measurements for solar photovoltaic or PV as we call it. The satellite data is quite sufficient and even accepted by the banks. And that normally is the real test of risk and understanding. When it comes to the wind resource, that requirement is 1 year of data. That does require on-site data because the topography of the landscape does impact wind in a way that obviously it doesn't with PV. But there, for Eskom to require 2 years is not necessary. So what we've started to do today as Saippa is draw up a letter back to Eskom. I've already had a discussion with the head of the grid access unit, so they are very amenable to further conversation. And we're going to tabulate those issues that you mentioned and a few others with suggestions of what we believe would be adequate to meet both the needs of industry and the critical need that Eskom is responsible for to make sure that any grid connection capacity that is allocated is indeed used very quickly so that that generation capacity can start producing.
So one of the things you said, especially around cost, is that we could see this go up to about 30 million rand to get a project to the point of financial close. Up to now, one of the quotes you have given recently is that you, as developers, have had to spend about 20%, that's 6 million rand, of that amount before you know whether you can get a network connection. Given those figures, if nothing changes, where will that leave you as an industry?
It makes it very difficult for this industry, this country, this region to be prioritized by a lot of the big players. And that would be my fear, that people will look elsewhere when we really want to entice and invite people to come and develop projects in the region. And that's really what it's all about, because even doing a PPA heads of terms requires lawyers on both sides. It requires governance, and the cost and the time really does put us on the back foot in terms of being able to know that you get into the queue to get a good connection opportunity.
Ultimately, you are business, right? And the question becomes whether these arguments for a relaxation, if you will, of the requirements on the side of government is A, driven by the need to assist the country to get out of the energy crisis primarily, or more of an issue where it would ultimately A, be too cumbersome, but B, make it difficult to see the sort of financial returns, a profit, which you would want to do, as any business would want to do when it embarks on an endeavor.
It's all about these are new rules that were announced by Eskom late last week. And so there's been discussions in the public domain on what they could be. We understood that they would go to the Grid Code Advisory Committee. We prepared a submission for the Grid Code Advisory Committee on which one of our board members sits. But it was not discussed at that meeting in March. So the issue really is, how much risk is a company prepared to take on a specific project before you deal with the levels of risk and uncertainty in the different areas of the development of the project. And those risk areas need to be addressed in unison. I call project development the art of parallel process, so that you don't get a situation where one big unanswered question remains, but you have to spend all the money on the other areas.
And if these sort of companies begin to look elsewhere, which other markets would they perhaps consider providing with electricity, if not South Africa?
Well, I think the world over, alternative energy, mostly renewables, is growing at a rapid rate. And so there would be a lot of markets that are already ahead of South Africa in terms of the structure of the market. There's over 100 countries worldwide that have already liberalized their market enough to really entice private participation, which South Africa's only just been getting to in the last couple of years, apart from the big renewables program, which is a world-renowned program. But most countries in the world have an independent transmission and system and market operator, so that the grid is actually the backbone of the electricity system. And electrons can be inputted into the grid by any generator of any technology with all of the associated technical and commercial and regulatory requirements. So it's the grid that remains the absolute critical element. There's no talk of that being privatized. It's a natural monopoly and is planned to remain a state-owned enterprise. Many countries in the world would have small portions of private investment in that, to bring the necessary business acumen to that process. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it has to be a well-regulated monopoly. And that's something that is certainly an imperative going forward.
Monopoly is never a good thing, I suppose, but thank you for speaking to us tonight. Brian Day, speaking to us from the SA Association of Independent Power Producers.